They'll gladly pay you by the hour for a minute or so, so you can sign off on the towers where they'll piss on your home. And if you feel like you're just powerless to answer them no, it's 'cause you are. They'll gladly pay you by the hour for a minute or so, so you can sign off on the towers where they'll piss on your home. And if you feel like you're just powerless to answer them no, it's 'cause you are. It's 'cause you are. They'll gladly stagnate a living wage, snap the chains, bury it. Labor slaves in rusty cages dragged behind a chariot, led by Mr. Racial Jungle, Joseph or Iscariot, fighting over scraps as they barrage us all with variants and BuzzFeed clickbait, straight until we're paralyzed, trying to distract us from the concentration camps that Joe had swore he'd close but only chose to amplify, where they got 50-something kids in cages made for 5 to occupy. And no, she hasn't seen the camps, but Harris swears they're paradise. She tells us the facilities are safe, and that right down to the women, they are regularly sterilized. Then she throws her head back and she proceeds to laugh, that sort of heartless cackle you'd expect from someone working steadfastly on behalf of the virus and a Congress full of parasites. And where was I? I was busy cashing every blue check, demonstrating plainly all the narratives expected from the verified. I was busy breeding verbal leeches by the terabyte. Train them to exsanguinate the wealthy while they sleep at night. Bleed the oil barons dry and barren, say they showed us how to share and now we share alike. Tell them I contracted rabies from a feral mic. Now I'm just another species losing sleep to noise pollution and these glaring lights, forced to change its habits and adapt to just survive. But now it's safe to say that some of us are thriving in the moment, throwing shit on presidential homes beneath the Paris skies. So if you feel like you're just powerless, I guess you bought the lie. But I can tell they're petrified of our collective might, 'cause I can hear those gentrifiers weeping at the sight of our collective rights. And I only can imagine the intensifying fear of knowing revolution's near, and all that's left to do is simply wallow in the thick anticipation of a rabid bite. And baby, one day you can ask your leaders just what that was like before you grab a slice. So if you think you're powerless, allow me now to change your mind. Honey, if you think you're powerless, allow me now to change your mind. See, they'll pay you hourly, tax them each apart, and build a shining tower out of loopholes and cards, and tell you that you're powerless to keep you in the dark, because you aren't, because we aren't. You see, they'll pay you hourly, tax them each apart, and make you build a shining tower out of loopholes and cards, where they'll tell you that you're powerless to keep you in the dark, because you aren't, because we aren't. False alarm. I thought that help was here, but it was my own reassurance bouncing round 100,000 times in my own ecosphere. If every time you speak you keep it off the record, consequently you can keep your record clear. And if you mute the speech that shakes your frail beliefs, you only seek to insulate your image and continue down the stream in the direction clout and credit steers. Directly from your mouth into am I the asshole Reddit's ears. directly back into the greasy pockets of some Gates Foundation financiers, and then directly back into the frantic final thoughts of early trial Neuralink volunteers, staring at the numb and mumbling vacancies where recently had been their peers, half of whom are glitching with the memory stuck on pause, and half have zero fucking clue just who they are or why they're here. It's been said that fear is all we have to fear, but that was back before the basosphere condenser came along, distilling concentrated fear that's diamond pure, crystal clear, oppressor strong, and woven into every single article you read and song they let you hear. And then Elon heard that Jeff enhanced our fears by 86%, and he said, hold my beer. And not a single sheep among the herd would turn their head or say a word, cause they were all too busy begging for the shears, begging for the muzzle, happy just to guzzle, feed, and watch a screen for all their years. Man, to each his own, can't afford a home, but they'll let you have your cozy little ecosphere, where there among your own devices you can break the seventh seal, overthrow the oracles, and slay the seer. All the tomes were burned and all the lips were seared. Shut your eyes and all our lives just disappear. Now blink 'em twice. Welcome to your ecosphere. I think I liked it better being blind, when I couldn't read between the lines, and when I couldn't see the cracks in the structure that lay bare before me the whole time. I think I liked it better back when I suspended disbelief and swallowed pride. I thought I knew the difference in the red from the blue, but they both bleed us so dry. They both bleed us so dry. My favorite songs don't hit the same way. I get to the end of a 4-minute track and I'm only looking back thinking, what did they actually say? So I try to sit down with my wife and watch TV, but I just see propaganda elevating the police in the simplest of sitcom banter, and tiny little altars full of offerings to corporate masters in every well-planned wide pan shot of the name brand stocking up the pantry. Pull back one long tracking shot out to the garage to the logo on the Camry. Nice tight shot of the Camry, close-up view of the Camry, slow pan up on the Camry, long slow zoom to the unmoving human who's up in the front with the tube pumping fumes to him straight from the back of the Camry. Ashamed he just could not provide for himself, let alone for his family. It's a blue pill mindset that spent 2020 making dance beats. I think I liked it better being blind, when I couldn't read between the lines, and when I couldn't see the cracks in the structure that lay bare before me the whole time. I think I liked it better back when I suspended disbelief and swallowed pride, and thought I knew the difference in the red from the blue, but they both bleed us so dry. They both bleed us so dry. Ignorance is bliss, which explains why a lot of us are so fucking happy.
quick to take the trip for all its trappings. Never one to ask what's up, what's going on, or God forbid what's happening. A lot of us would strap into the ride and then spit right in the eye of the guy whose job it is to snap your fastenings. But maybe we're all born with that capacity. Maybe each of us comes standard with humor, compassion, malice, and audacity. Some of us are blind to the system, but some see it fine and say this is how it has to be. Some of us can stare wide-eyed at a nationwide human catastrophe and only offer platitudes and recipes. And I wish that I could tell myself that nothing's worth obsessing past my everyday necessities. I wish that I could cry fake news over anything that threatened me, tune out our abuses and consume a little levity. Wish that I could offer up my son a smoother destiny. Wish I had some better lessons for how best to answer questions for the things I've been perpetually questioning. But I'm too busy looking at our leaders, wondering what I might be missing from their messaging. Trying to find the reasoning to let 250,000 people meet an early reckoning. And even though I know the truth, it's hard to swallow something that's so literally sickening. Hope is ever dwindling, COVID ever beckoning. Winter slows your breathing, but your pulse is ever quickening. Even though I know the truth, it's hard to keep listening. I'm done with my epiphany, my innocence is blistering. I'd like to think I'd taste the earth before I'd ever kiss the ring. Hard to speak the truth and harder still to keep listening.
Sometimes I think I miss being blind, when I couldn't read between the lines, and when I couldn't see the cracks in the structure that lay bare before me the whole time. I think I liked it better back when I suspended disbelief and swallowed pride. Thought I knew the difference in the red from the blue, but they both bleed us so dry. Both bleed us so dry. Both bleed us so dry. They both bleed us so dry.
Legend says that Hercules swept Cerberus right off his feet and effortlessly set him down softly as a songbird. Atlas kept the world upon his back and every day wondered whether he could stand it any longer. And Reade came out to say the man they tried to label the messiah of morality was really just another rapist. And I don't intend to hesitate when asked who was the stronger. Tara, like Assange, knew that carrying the truth would be the hardest labor. Tara knew that her assailant wasn't gonna make us any safer, and knew he's just the type of man to hand a decent foreign leader US-printed walking papers, and knew he'd be relentless and aggressive in the war he'd wage upon her very character, that his attempts to weaken and degrade and embarrass her would be her only compensation. But I strongly doubt that anyone could ever have foreseen the stream of hate that came from quote-unquote progressives and the self-styled titans of survivor advocation. So if you really think there's something to be gained out of sharing your pain with the world, you are sorely mistaken. The Biden team just dragged their feet addressing Tara's allegations. Until they had a decent list of smears, then they aired them out on every station. And it turns out no one wants to hear the truth of who they praised as being worthy of such bloated liberal celebration. that no one wants to really know the person they've so valiantly defended, even when it meant they had to gloat and shit all over someone braver than they'd be if given the occasion. Now cue the faceless comment squad invasion.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Politics of the Survival. And I am your host, Tara Reade. I have with me one of my favorite investigative journalists, and he's all the way streaming from Spain to be with us today. He's a Sputnik journalist, and you can read the rest of his bio and hear about him as we talk. So welcome, Wyatt Reed. It's the Reade and Reed show, right?
There's plenty of Reed to go around.
That's right. We'll get a lot more jokes out of that for the rest of the stream, right?
Well, we can only, it's all downhill from here now that we got that first one out of the way.
The Reade and Reed show, yeah. So tell me about why you're in Spain and what brought you. I know there was some sort of big, the elites were meeting somewhere. So, right?
Yeah, so I came to Spain actually last month to Madrid to the NATO summit, which was basically the second event in a handful of days in late June, where elites from a number of Western countries gathered, leaders, and they basically accomplished very little other than to put out a series of statements and to create sort of this illusion of strength, show of unity among NATO allies, which is a far cry from the reality, right? We're, here in Spain, for example, last month hit a 37-year high in terms of inflation, double-digit inflation. Everybody's suffering. And, just this past week there's a massive heat wave here in Western Europe, in case viewers don't know. So we've had 510 victims here in Spain of this heat wave, over 1,000 between Spain and Portugal alone. This is, for the first time hitting well over 100 degrees in the United Kingdom. This is something that's not typical, 40 degrees Celsius in the United Kingdom, not normal. And meanwhile, this is going on with sort of this kind of ghost in the background, right? That everyone's sort of, there's a ghost haunting Europe, as they say, and it's the specter of heat insecurity, of energy insecurity, of the fact that, right now with these sort of energy issues, with the inability to keep things cool, we're getting a sense of what it's going to be like here in the winter when Germany, as Deutsche Bank, for example, has already warned, could go back to burning wood, could go back to basically, Middle Ages style people having to forage for their own heating. So this is where we're at, right? And, it's not necessarily popular to talk about, especially in the United States. Everyone wants to hear rah, 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 go US, go Zelensky, go Team Freedom. Meanwhile, here in Europe and in Spain in particular, the reality is significantly more complicated.
Right. And, I was going to ask you about the perception, because in the United States, I've been, along with a handful of other people, have been trying to raise up the awareness that there's a lot of neo-Nazis in Ukraine, including the Azov Battalion and the 14,000, Russian nationals that were murdered over the last 8 years. The perception here is by the mainstream press is to push back on it and call it propaganda. And I know the BBC, for example, airbrushed the Nazi, symbols off the uniforms when they would show coverage. What is it in Europe? Are they more realistic and kind of ignoring that propaganda and seeing through it? Or are they as kind of, I don't know, brain dead, basically, as some Americans are about this subject?
Well, I think, as always, it depends on who you go and where you go, I should say, and who you ask. There's always going to be a group of, that's willing to engage in this kind of willful ignorance. I think for people here, it's more of a living memory, in the sense that while the United States did obviously participate in World War II, that was mainly, first of all, in the Pacific, that most of the U.S. engagement happened. There wasn't actually a whole lot of U.S. versus Nazi fighting engagement at the end of the day. But that aside, people had to deal with the crimes of Nazis in a way that people in the United States didn't. They had to deal with the legacy of what it meant, what fascism actually meant. People's grandparents here, have a legacy in Spain with, fighting against Franco, fighting against fascism themselves. That's very much a part of the history that's alive. That you can meet people that, fought with other people, that fought against fascism, that for whom this was, a major aspect of their identity. People who, and that legacy of fascism here obviously hasn't gone anywhere. That's alive and well, and you can meet people who suffered from the legacy of the so-called anti-terror campaigns against the ETA, against the Basque separatists, and then obviously just everyday normal Basque people who got caught up in this kind of fascistic terror. So there is a sense, in a way that I think you don't necessarily have in the US, of this being that living history. But at the end of the day, there's still a lot of brainwashing. There's still a lot of propaganda. There's plenty of people that get caught up in that. I would say, for people who are now really struggling and suffering from this in a way that maybe in the United States it hasn't quite hit quite as hard yet. Right. I think people here are really on the front lines of that inflation, that economic suffering. We in the United States aren't necessarily as economically dependent on Russia, which was part of the reason why it made it so easy for our leaders to say, we should all get off Russian gas. We should all get off Russian fertilizer, get off, while we have 2% of our gas coming from Russia, for many European countries, it's a majority. They're willing to, they being the US government is more than happy to let Europe bear the brunt of all those costs, to let them, throw themselves on the pile. And meanwhile, obviously, plenty of other people are standing to benefit. Obviously not the working people of Europe, but US gas companies will step in. And that's what's happened for the first time in Spain now. A majority of the energy, a majority of the gas is coming from the United States for the first time ever, right? It's all being shipped in on tankers all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, which is incredibly expensive, incredibly inefficient. But, this is one of those things where it's, obviously at the end of the day, somebody's going to benefit from the situation in Ukraine. And when it comes to energy, when it comes to military, when it comes to weapons, I should say, you just, again and again, you look and, cast this, who is it that stands to gain? Over and over again, it's NATO, it's the United States, the military industrial complex.
Right. Yeah. Their profits have, I think, quadrupled in just 120 days, actually. And that's not even counting the money that's been given by, wow. 57 billion right now by the US government has been given to Ukraine, which of course they can't account for. They don't know what's happened to some of the weapons and they're ending up in the black market. And you're, in Spain, so I'm sure you're hearing about that. I wanted to ask you a couple of things. So it's kind of a two-part question. With your journalism, I've noticed that it's very much opening up the lens so you can look from different perspectives, which is why I follow your work and appreciate it. So what brought you to work for Sputnik, and how has censorship affected you and your work, if at all? So what was your trajectory to be where you are now, actually?
I came to Sputnik about 2.5 years ago, and I was reporting on the coup d'etat in Bolivia, the US-backed coup d'etat that took place in November 2019. This was a bloody, horrific event that I had a colleague that called me one day because I'd been, tweeting about this, putting it out on social media, trying to call attention to it because it was something that mainstream media was simply ignoring. They just didn't want to touch it. When they did, it was full of just these weasel words, these kind of loaded terms, basically blaming Evo Morales for the coup, blaming his indigenous supporters for being massacred by these crazy evangelical, like Bible thumping white supremacists who were put into power at the behest, some would say, depending on who you ask. I'm not sure if we still have quite the smoking gun to be able to say that legally without getting, Gary Webbed or whatever. But you can certainly all the dots are there. If you could connect them, that's on you. And actually, I should mention I'm working on a documentary that's coming out hopefully by the end of the year called Justicia, that deals with exactly this, deals with the search for justice in Bolivia by the victims of that coup. And so I was down there reporting on that, working kind of freelance. I was putting some pieces out with the Gray Zone, and I got a call from a producer at Sputnik who was transferring over to a different position there and wanted to know if I'd be interested in taking over. And I said, absolutely, because it's very hard to find steady paid salary journalism that's just in general, but especially that's not going to be, it's going to allow you to buck the status quo a little bit, to
freedom.
To say what you actually think.
Lee Camp and I talked about that at length because I don't know if you noticed, but both our podcasts were pulled down on the same day and they censored RT. So RT produced this podcast, Politics of Survival, originally, no longer, they're now censored here. And then, of course, RT in England, they pulled their license, which I think is highly illegal, but anyway, but they're the best place to work for. It was just wonderful because, all the content was my own. I picked the guests. I did just what I'm doing now. Like it was all my own. They were very, very accommodating. And then Lee Camp said the same thing, and he worked for them for 8 years. And he just said it was the best. You're never going to find a media outlet in the Western Hemisphere like they were. So I really understand, doing that. The censorship is a shame. Back to Bolivia, it's interesting you brought that up because a good friend of mine named Wendy Dale is a writer. She's an author. She's married to a Bolivian and went through the coup, and they lost everything. And they had to walk to Peru, and they didn't have paperwork. It was they're still sorting the paperwork years later now in Peru, but like they're living safely in Peru. But they had, a good life. And she talked about the wonderful medical care. Like she had broken her ankle and had to have rehab. And I think it cost her all of $30, right, in American money. And she had to have people don't understand, and Evo Morales, she said, was really helping his people. But he also, one of the things he did was he stood up to the empire and said no to them trying to resource that lithium, which there's that famous Elon Musk tweet that says, we'll coup who we want. Now, he said that was a joke, but that's sort of the American arrogance, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, joke or not, it's the same attitude. It's the same perspective that you can assume was behind everything they said, and especially with what we heard from John Bolton recently, talking about the various coups that he planned. We know Bolivia was among them. You'd have to be an absolute moron not to believe that. They were looking for a win. They had failed in Venezuela. They had failed in Nicaragua. Somebody obviously at some moment pitched Trump Bolivia, and he said, let's go for this. They put the wheels in motion. And I actually wrote before the coup happened in August of 2019, a full couple months, we started to see the wheels of the U.S. coup machine, regime change machine, grind into motion with the fires in the Amazon that were mainly caused by the destructive agricultural practices of Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, but which were cynically used by a group of people who claim to be left, but who have a shocking amount of connections within intelligence-linked circles, who have just an incredibly easy time getting their articles published all throughout the mainstream media. They basically launched this campaign to blame all of these wildfires in the Amazon on Evo Morales. And this was somewhat successful. And you had basically the beginning of the attempt to remove left support for Evo Morales from among Western leftists, right? Really talking about liberals, but people who would describe themselves as left, people who would, however, be very open to this idea of some extractivist authoritarian leader. Evo Morales, this narrative that Evo Morales was once good. They did the same thing with Hugo Chavez. Once he was good, but he just went too far. And lo and behold, and I don't believe the Western media necessarily, but in this particular occasion, they happen to be right. That was sort of the narrative that came out. And the person who was in charge of this was a woman named Janice Bacadasta. She basically went to school, Harvard Kennedy School, had all these connections with, for example, Sergei Popovich, who's the head of what was called Otpor, this network of Serbian regime change activists that was activated as a part of the color revolution, really the first color revolution. So this is who she's linked up with the Human Rights Foundation, Oslo Forum. This is the sort of the person who is in charge of beginning this media blitz in 2019 to lead the way, to pave the path for the regime change that they would then put into action in November, with the complicity, obviously, of not just the US, but also especially the OAS, the Organization of American States, which was instrumental in legitimizing all these narratives about so-called electoral fraud that were used to force Evo Morales out and subsequently even try to take his life. They attempted, according to a number of people who were in a first-hand position to know, they attempted to shoot his jet out of the sky as he was leaving. We're talking about a Mexican presidential jet. This is the lengths they were willing to go. And thankfully they were able to avoid that. But to say that, the US, that all these, that all this stuff about the CIA is somehow in the past, that this is something they did formerly, maybe back in the days of the 50s, but, Guatemala and Iran, but no, this is the reality, is that they continue to do these same things. They've just gotten better at them. They've gotten better at hiding it.
It's interesting. They hide in plain sight, don't they? Especially because of the internet being able to lift up. But like, I remember hearing about, they went to his home, to Evo Morales, so they threatened his family. They killed his dog, his pet. I mean, just brutal, just ugly, brutal force was used, and it was backed by, Western. And, I don't know if you saw this, but yesterday, Victoria Nuland was in Brazil. And so I don't know, whenever I see Victoria Nuland traveling to a country, I wonder, how long before something happens? Like her track record, right? Like with what happened in Ukraine in 2014. Victoria Nuland shows up and lo and behold, there's a coup. So.
Yeah, hopefully she wasn't handing out any cookies down there in Rio de Janeiro. I don't know what she was doing, but
what is their situation now?
Sorry,
because there's I'm sorry, what is their situation now with in Brazil? Because I know there's a lot of unrest in Argentina and some other countries because of inflation, because of access. So what's going on with that right now? Do you know?
With Brazil, I couldn't say if there's any particular issue of strife. We have elections obviously slated for October. These are really important because they will be a chance again for Lula to come back into power. He's heavily favored, leading by double digits in most of the polls that I've seen so far.
Yeah.
There's, an issue, and I've heard some people kind of pointing to the fact that Bolsonaro might be willing to kind of buck the international consensus in terms of maybe COVID, or in terms of, especially in terms of buying fertilizer from Russia, from refusing to sanction Russia, refusing to attack it at the UN. I don't know how far I trust Bolsonaro, though. I don't know. I've heard some kind of more supportive comments, or maybe more sympathetic comments from Glenn Greenwald on this. I'm not exactly. I understand, obviously, he is the subject, in the same way that Donald Trump was, of this pretty concerted sort of big tech effort to censor him and to prevent people from hearing what he has to say. I don't know that I ascribe that any real sense of political or moral leadership to him that I would want to back up. And I think, generally speaking, I don't know, you have kind of a new slate of leftist governments that's learned on some level, like, we have to play ball with the US, because otherwise they're just going to coup us. They're just going to show up. You see this kind of in Honduras, and I think Colombia. You see it maybe too much in Chile with, Boric. But you have kind of this recognition that, okay, we're going to have to deal with the gringos in some way. We can't throw them out. We can't just kill them all. They're there. They have, massive military bases, and we have massive economic ties with them. We can't just, take our ball and go home.
Right.
So I don't know that, obviously this isn't to say that they're like collaborators, just that, there is this kind of new wave of the pink tide, where I think there's this realism and pragmatism that's kind of had to prevail, because the alternative, really, as they've seen, is just being couped.
Right. I hear you. Yeah. And going back to the NATO, because that's why you were originally there in Spain. Today, I don't know if you might not have even heard this, but there was a vote happening in the United States. And anyway, what was termed the progressive, some of the termed progressive, they're called the Squad, the Democrats, voted for NATO. And like, there's this support by Democrats, or the perceived progressives, of supporting NATO and intelligence services. And it's just been this shift, if you will, or at least visible shift. Maybe it was happening behind the scenes before, but now it's visible. So I wanted to ask you about that, because in my estimation, NATO asserts itself as a defensive, entity, but it just has done so much damage. And I just believe it should be abolished. But, apparently that's not the same thinking of some Westerners. So what is your kind of read on the mood in Europe and what you saw with the NATO summit and citizens, views of this?
Yeah, so there were a lot of announcements about supposed efforts to kind of revitalize NATO, to draw in, obviously, Sweden and Finland into what they term a defensive alliance. I'm not sure the last time NATO has done any defending. I remember the last few engagements it was involved in: Syria, Libya, Afghanistan. Obviously, all wars of aggression backed by the West against Middle Eastern nations, North African nations. Some of them really for the only apparent crime of kind of trying to develop themselves independently of the Western economic order, the so-called international rules-based order. That's Gaddafi, for example, who at one point led the most prosperous African nation until Libya came and defended it. NATO came and defended Libya from Libyans.
We all know how that turned out. Yeah.
Well, they brought back slavery to the African continent. They return of open air slave markets. That was the legacy of Obama, right? That's his legacy in Libya.
And that brutal assassination of their leader.
Right. In terms of how this actually plays out, though, right? I think they announced something like 2 new naval destroyers to Spain, a whole new F-35, 2 new F-35 squadrons to the UK. They want to open up supposedly an entire new army base in Poland. And I think the big question is, where's all the money going to come from, right? And according to some reports, you know, Finland, there's this big question about why do Sweden and Finland necessarily even want to join NATO.
Right.
According to some reports, Finnish officials have envisioned reducing their spending under this new plan, according to, you know, the terms under which they joined NATO, from 4% to 2%, and essentially let the gringos take over the rest. You know, let the U.S. just pay for it. Let the taxpayers there in the United States do all the heavy lifting, which is something obviously former President Donald Trump railed against a number of times, kind of basically Americans having to pay for Europe's security, quote unquote, under NATO, and, you know, not really getting anything in return for the American taxpayer. He was right about that. That was the correct, you know, obviously I wouldn't agree with the way that he characterized that. We know that NATO is not a defensive alliance. NATO is effectively a resource extraction machine, and it functions as, you know, as a way of doing what Julian Assange, with regard to Afghanistan, said was basically a laundromat for money, for laundering the United States tax base out and dumping it back into the military industrial complex. The same principle applies, obviously, with Ukraine today.
Absolutely. Well said. And speaking of Assange, and, you know, we were talking earlier about censorship, as you know, as an investigative journalist, watching the events unfolding with Assange, who's an Australian citizen being extradited to the US, which is mind-boggling under the Espionage Act, when he was basically a publisher and a reporter himself, a journalist himself, and he exposed war crimes of the US, and there's no question. And in fact, none of the reporting has been challenged or turned over. It was accurate reporting, but he's given up his freedom for that. How does that play into your work, and what are you seeing on the horizon with the Assange case? What does that mean as a, you know, being in the profession of journalism for you?
Yeah, the Julian Assange case is he's the canary in the mine shaft, right? He's the one who's going to, as Julian goes, we all go. If Julian isn't free to be able to have exposed what he exposed, and he can effectively be summoned and rendered, you know, kind of an extraordinary rendition style, just taken, seized from a third country and jammed into the United States justice system under the idea he's effectively some kind of enemy combatant for the crime of journalism. Well, then what does that say about the rest of us? I mean, it's just, if they are able to successfully prosecute him for violating, you know, the Espionage Act, a crime that does not apply to an Australian citizen, then obviously they can apply that to American citizens. And, you know, really the lack of outcry, I should say, from the Australian government says a lot. You know, Anthony Albanese is saying effectively, we're not going to say anything. We're not going to ask the United States. You have to go to Mexico. You have to go to President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador to actually find some real solidarity with, you know, an Australian citizen. With, you know, you're not getting it from the Americans. You're certainly not getting it from the Australians. You have to go in the same way, you know. And AMLO, obviously, I should say, the news just came out that when he met with Biden recently in the past couple of weeks, he gave him a letter demanding basically that he release Julian Assange, saying he has committed no serious crime. No one died because of anything that Julian Assange did. And that message seems to be falling on deaf ears. But what you have with this, I think, is really the loss of any last vestiges of like the moral superiority that the U.S. claimed on the international stage. Anybody sitting in the middle who's not necessarily with Russia or China, but might be less inclined to go one way or the other, is going to look at this and see exactly what the reality is in terms of U.S. rhetoric around human rights, democracy, et cetera, all these things they use to meddle in other countries. Now they're going to look at that, I think, a little bit differently, especially, and it's good to have figures like AMLO who are actually standing up for human rights on an international level, who are able to create, go back to the sort of historic Mexican foreign policy of actually playing a neutral role, giving political asylum to people on both sides of this kind of Cold War dynamic.
Right, and you brought up Mexico. It brought back the memory of last week when the Mexican president lectured Joe Biden for 30 minutes, and I liked that. That was amazing. He said his piece, and I don't know if it probably went right over Biden's head, but the point was really interesting, and I like the way he's been so outspoken calling out the imperialism. And then I think yesterday the Chinese, which is really unusual and it really caught my attention, but the Department of Ministry of China, which usually is very silent, is calling on US and England to be investigated for human rights violations and for war crimes. So that was really stunning and good. I mean, I feel like there's a shift, but I'm not sure where it's going. And I wanted to ask you, you described the unipolar push that the Western nations are trying to hold on to power, right? And economic, military. But there's this multipolar world happening where obviously the other parts of the world are growing economically and thriving and innovating. So do you think that the Western nations will finally get a clue and become partners and innovate and create and compete in the marketplace effectively without using war? Or do you think we are in the beginning of World War III? I mean, what is your thought on that?
Well, they're certainly not dumb. They're definitely aware that this process is happening. In fact, just a few days ago, Tony Blair had these remarks at an international forum saying that we're witnessing the end of Western domination, that for the first time we're having a multipolar, a bipolar, if not multipolar world order. And obviously they're not stupid. They understand this is happening. However, the response to this is, and therefore we need to step up our military spending. Everyone needs to pay more for NATO budgets, and we need to spend more resources on so-called soft power, which is like, how can you do more? Where's the extra money going to come from? You guys are about to be burning sticks and come winter, and you're like rummaging around for, I don't know where, in the couch cushions, trying to find up whatever change you can dump into this, latest anti-Russia regime change effort. It's insane, but that's where we're at. And they're obviously focused, I think, long-term more on China, because they realize that economically that's, going to be the main force that is able to break the back of the petrodollar. And, you have expressions, I think, of this all across, the Shanghai cooperation conference. And you have especially BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. We have now talks for Argentina and for Iran, a number of countries looking at joining this bloc, which I think is going to emerge as a rival to, these Western-backed organisms that ultimately kind of serve as tools of the United States, especially, but really, the main NATO powers. You have really the emergence of this whole alternative global world order that, obviously to figures like Tony Blair, noted war criminal, who's never faced justice, and who never, unlike Julian Assange, will never spend a day in his life in prison for the hundreds of thousands of deaths that are on his hands. Meanwhile, Julian Assange has none. But you can read from what Blair is saying about this, that there is this recognition among the ruling class. Yes, the world is changing, but we just have to keep ramping up our military spending, slash social spending, so that we can just, really suck these Western societies dry for everything they're worth, launder that back into this military industrial complex, just spend like crazy on this endless war machine. And meanwhile, what is Russia offering? What is China offering? Well, like pretty much no strings attached kind of loans, very low interest, extremely cheap natural gas, extremely cheap fertilizer, very few strings attached. You want it, it's cheap, you can buy it, you're welcome to it, just pay us. And that's about how it works. So obviously this is a much more attractive deal to much of the rest of the world.
So do you think in this global game of chicken that Germany will be the first one that blinks and says, yeah, we're gonna and let go of the US? I mean, I'm just wondering if at some point some of the European nations are gonna be like, you're not doing that much for us. We're turning east. Go east. I don't know.
Well, somebody's gonna blink eventually, and I doubt very much that it's gonna be Russia.
No.
You don't hear people in Russia complaining about the fact, you don't hear people in Russia having to ration hot water.
Right.
You don't hear them talking about we're cutting out street lights at night. You don't hear them, basically having to deal with hundreds and hundreds of casualties of heat waves.
Right.
Somebody is suffering right now. It's not Russia. It's not the Russian people. These sanctions have backfired, as we all know now. And so, the question, I think, it's a good question. Will it be France or Germany or Italy?
Italy's
who exactly is
gonna... Yeah, Italy's losing government right now. So I don't know. People are losing confidence in their governments. And I think Boris Johnson's resignation, Italy's kind of up in the air. So then that leaves, so yeah. And then you have Ireland doing its thing. But I guess what I wanted to also ask you about the future of this is one of the things that's been concerning here in the US, and I don't know if you're seeing it overseas as much, but in a lot of the media, they're talking about nuclear war. They're like rationalizing it. Like there was one article that came out that said, oh, well, if there's a limited nuclear war, it would be okay. They're trying to like placate people. And then the New York Emergency Services released a video about what to do in a nuclear strike. So is this fear porn, or is there actually, do you think, a movement of the West to try to bring us to that brink, really?
I think it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. On the one hand, yes, there is this element that just ready to kind of freak people out and to kind of get them going back into this Cold War kind of mindset. I mean, I think mainly it's an attempt to normalize this, to get this into the back of people's brains in the same way that, you had the duck and cover ads in the 50s. It wasn't actually to save anybody. It wasn't to get them to actually preserve their lives in some way. It was to get people willing to be able to, wrap their heads around, oh, maybe the end of the world is imminent at any moment because these damn Ruskies, are always up to no good and probably just want to murder us at any moment. That's kind of the psychology that I view behind this. I don't know that, ultimately, I think there is a hesitation on the US side to, nobody wants to be the one to push it to the nuclear level. And, obviously Joe Biden can't, he's not really even there. Like he can't even decide what he wants to eat for breakfast, what pants he wants to put on, and even how to get them on. So, but somebody has to be in charge of making this decision to elevate it to a nuclear level. And I haven't seen maybe quite as much willingness as I think I would need to see in the part of, I think you'd have to see this campaign ramp up even more. You'd have to see more politicians start emphasizing this nuclear option in speeches to really know for sure that now they're ready to put this on the table. Hopefully, and fingers crossed, hopefully we haven't gotten there yet.
Right. Yeah, the Russophobia is out of control. It's one of the things I push back on. The xenophobia is not helpful to the Western world at all, and I don't understand it. It's disgusting to me. Like banning tennis players and banning athletes from participating and artists from doing their work. It's ridiculous, and it's interesting. The same people that scream about certain social policies and racism are engaging in bigotry and racism when it comes to Russia. So it's bizarre to see the cognitive dissonance around the whole issue.
I think it's because liberals finally have an acceptable object of their pent up internalized racism. Like, they haven't been able to say all this racist shit that they've been feeling for years because it's become socially unacceptable. So now finally it's like, okay, here's an outlet. Russians, like, they're white. Boom, I can say all this horrible shit that I've just been, been pent up inside me. Finally they have like a socially acceptable target for that, vitriol. But I think, in terms of the Russophobia, I mean, it's become a totally like acceptable on social media. For example, you're allowed to wish death against Russian people now. People all throughout Europe, you'll find viral videos of people refusing to serve Russian people, and that's just normal, just like casual sort of racism that's ostensibly illegal, but now the rules have changed. Now there is an acceptable target of racism, and that is Russian people. And there's this whole idea basically that we need to hold individual Russians accountable for what we say Putin is doing. And obviously this was never a standard that was applied during the Iraq War, right, during any of the dozens of US invasions and coups all throughout the entire world over the past decades. Nobody ever said, like, American athletes need to be prohibited from participating in the Olympics. Mm-hmm. No, nobody ever said, we're going to ban these people or hold them personally accountable, because until they say enough is enough and they get rid of their government, then we're just not willing to deal with them. All of a sudden, this is this new standard, and I think it's kind of like it goes along with this whole responsibility to protect, like, Samantha Power, Obama era liberal mindset that just like, it's okay for us to be the world police. We're going to go and enforce human rights and democracy on the rest of the world, which was terrible when Bush did it, but all of a sudden when Obama does it, now it's we're saving those poor Libyans from themselves, as I said earlier. Bashar al-Assad, he's a monster, and a war criminal, and he gassed his own people, and we need to save those poor Syrians by giving all this weapons and military aid to ISIS or whoever the fuck.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then the military aid ends up in a lot of other places that it's not supposed to be anyway. So and it shouldn't have been there in the first place. But what's interesting to me too is the vitriol towards Vladimir Putin, which, I wrote about it in 2018. I was just writing a piece. And of course, when I came forward about Joe Biden, it was immediately all the stuff I said that was positive about Vladimir Putin was thrown at me. And I was
right. I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. But the truth is, he is really good at protecting his country and his people. And for instance, they just got a boost in benefits to help them through not only the pandemic, but then the conflict that just broke out. And meanwhile, in the United States, they're just piling money into Ukraine, and people can't buy baby formula. And there's supply chain issues. I mean, it's really remarkable. So I've stood by. In fact, I have to tell you, Wyatt, I had, I won't say who the reporter is, but it was someone very well known, said to me at the break of the war, said, Tara, you have to come out and denounce Putin and call him evil, or we won't cover your story. Your story will never be covered again. No one will believe you. And people are distancing themselves. And he kept saying, say he's evil, say he's, and I said, no. And then I doubled down and just said, not only that, but I'm going to talk about why we are. I'm going to talk about the coup in 2014 and why, and pushing the borders. And so, yeah, you don't see the story about me in mainstream media anywhere at all. And you probably never will again. Joe Biden got away with what he did, and that's that. But I truly stand by my belief system that the predatoriness and imperialism is coming from the West, not from the East. And, I don't live in Russia. I haven't been there, so I can't speak to what their daily life is like, but they have medical care, they have family leave, they have, I do know that much. And the people, and the ruble is one of the highest currencies in the world right now. And there's been a very vested interest in protecting his people. So I guess, what I've noticed is with other journalists is that like Aaron Mate, Glenn Greenwald, or yourself, you get piled on if you give a different narrative than the State Department. You get threats and things like that, like what just, it's terrible. Like Patrick Lancaster just had to go offline because of that. He just had a bunch of threats.
We get deplatformed. We get removed entirely from, for example, PayPal. I got kicked off of PayPal.
So you did?
Yeah, I mean, they just, it's not even like I was advertising it. I just had a link on my Twitter bio, and it wasn't that I went out saying all this, but obviously this was a part of that British state intelligence-backed effort that the Gray Zone uncovered recently with those leaked emails that showed Paul Mason, this supposedly left journalist, kind of fixture in British politics, was actually collaborating with a man named Andy Price, who's the head of the British Foreign Counter Disinformation organization. This, British intelligence group that was ostensibly aimed at protecting Britain from disinformation from foreign state-backed actors. They were targeting people like us, right? They bragged about having successfully taken down Consortium News, Mint Press News from PayPal, and then sure enough, within 24 hours of the first tweet I ever made about Paul Mason, I was also removed from PayPal. And we know from documents that we haven't necessarily, or I should say the Gray Zone hasn't necessarily published, that we haven't necessarily seen yet as a public. There are certainly indications that another British intelligence cutout called Valent that Paul Mason was dealing with was tracking myself, a number of other independent journalists, in regards to the Ethiopia attempted, U.S. intervention, support for the TPLF in this No More campaign that Ethiopians launched, demanding the West take its hands off and stop backing these TPLF terrorists against their elected government. They were definitely involved in monitoring, tracking, covering people who they labeled super spreaders of disinformation, like myself and a number of other journalists. And so, who knows exactly what they were doing with that information, where that was going, what levels of government that might have gone to. But we know these are the same figures that are obviously in charge of deplatforming basically any independent journalists who go too far in terms of whether it be the Ukraine conflict or, the dirty war on Syria, the Western attempted coup in Venezuela or Bolivia. It doesn't matter which particular conflict you pick, but as long as you stick your nose in a little too deep, you can end up on one of these lists. And then it means basically having people try to ruin your life. They want to make it impossible for you to continue doing what you do, getting the truth out, countering the real disinformation, the actual propaganda, of which, the United States Western mainstream media, the corporate media, is obviously far and away the number one propagator.
Absolutely. There's a lot of resources devoted to it. Absolutely. So Reef, I wanted to bring in the audience here. I know that there's been some chats and questions and comments. Did you want to highlight any of them for Wyatt?
Yes. There was one that, I had to scroll up because they were earlier.
Oh, there's a lot of comments. Okay.
Yep. So the new Chilean constitution, is that a proposal or is it the new constitution? Asks Yipper99.
As far as I'm aware, this hasn't been fully ratified. It's still in kind of the writing stages. I think it's being passed back and forth between chambers of Congress. I'm not totally caught up on the situation with that Chilean constitution. I know it's significantly more progressive than anything they've ever had, and obviously anything is better than the document that they currently have, which was written by fascists.
Right. INN member Lucy, I think, translated it in a Twitter thread. If people want to go find that, it should be pinned on her Twitter, I think, right now. But another question, Tara and Wyatt, what factors might stop us from this unlimited militarism and focus us back on helping people here at home? Asked Jara Brown.
Hey, Jara, thank you for tuning in. So I'm going to let Wyatt take this one. Go ahead.
That's a tough question. Honestly, it's hard to say. It's some days I feel like it's kind of it's got to get a little bit more bleak before it can get better. It really feels like right now, you don't have anybody in power that's willing to make any of these reasonable criticisms, is willing to acknowledge that
profession for what you do. I had Ava Bartlett on recently, and Alina Lipp. I don't know if you're familiar with her, the German journalist. She's now facing, you probably are, criminal charges for her reports in Donbass. So as far as she's concerned, her bank account got frozen, but not only hers, her father's, which I don't know how Germany did that, but they did. Do you have any concerns about U.S. retaliation or retaliation from a government with your reporting, or do you feel like, things are kind of shifting, and by the time you get there, that might not be as highly, I don't know, conflicting?
I wish I could say I'm more optimistic than I am. Okay. On the one hand, I don't want to, flatter myself that I think I'm such a big target for them, because, I think, first they've got to go through Julian Assange,
Yeah.
If they can do that to him, then they'll just start coming after the rest of us. But really, once they can establish this precedent, I think that's kind of the main impediment for now. That I'm not losing any sleep over it right now. I think they've kind of done about what they can in terms of trying to stop us from telling the truth. At least to me personally, they just, they hit me on, deplatform me from these, financial services. It's kind of, to me, it's like a micro form of sanctions. It's like, okay, we're just gonna, cut you off from a certain little financial service, try to make your life a little bit more difficult. Right. It's obviously nothing like what the victims of sanctions in Venezuela or Iran or Syria have to go through in terms of not having access to cancer drugs or things like that. But it's a little bit of a taste, right? And they, they do things like they censor us. I'll have videos that I put up that have more likes than they do views, and it's just, that's impossible. That can't
yeah, exactly. Right. Right. Yeah, that's big. Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, it's kind of shameless the way they're doing it, but this is, they said openly that we're going to take these unprecedented steps to drastically reduce the visibility of people we deem to be affiliated with the Russian government. So, they succeeded. They've basically reduced the visibility of the videos that I publish by like 90%. They've succeeded in terms of just really reducing our ability to be seen. If you type in my name on Twitter, you can't find me. I don't show up in the search results. You have to go directly to my name, or you have to find a tweet that I'm tagged in, or that so they take all these little steps because I don't think they're quite ready at this moment to go all the way to just shredding the First Amendment, to just, no more freedom of speech. That's it. In Europe, it's a little bit different because they don't necessarily have this historical tradition of freedom of speech in the same way. It's not held up as this kind of lofty ideal. But in the United States, I am grateful that at least our politicians still pretend to care about it.
Right. When
it suits them. At least they gesture towards it occasionally.
Yeah.
Even if it's hollow and totally cynical and self-serving, it's good to know that there is still this popular conception of it and this understanding, at least among normal people, that you shouldn't be censored for your political beliefs.
Absolutely. Well said. There you have it. Thank you, Wyatt Reed, for joining us today. And, because you mentioned it is difficult to find you. So how can people find you? Now, we did put links that are visible for people as they're watching the stream, but if you could tell people how to find you, and if you have a website or Substack, things like that.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. It's at Wyatt Reed 13. That's WYATTREED 13. I'm also on Substack, although I haven't been publishing very much. I'm going to start trying to share a little bit more of my writing that I do on Sputnik on that avenue, and on Telegram as well. You can find me there, mainly on Twitter. But keep an eye out. I'm definitely going to be publishing a number of articles here in the next few days. Be interesting to keep engaged. If you want to do that, you can check out those links, as you said.